Remember that our body has trillions of cells within it, so it's really important to coordinate the activity of all of those cells so that they are working together efficiently. Now, to do this, our body maintains a very specific set of internal conditions so that it can work without failure. This is why maintaining boundaries is important, because if we're going to maintain internal conditions, we have to separate internal from external. So let's go ahead and ask the question how the body maintains those stable internal conditions. So the term homeostasis refers to these stable internal conditions, even though the outside world is changing continuously. Now I'm going to explain homeostasis graphically, because homeostasis can be viewed as a narrow range in this blue shaded region here around a set point, which is represented by this horizontal purple dashed line here. So on our graph here, we have time on our horizontal axis and some variable like body temperature on our vertical axis here. So using this body temperature example, our body sets our resting normal body temperature at about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. So this is what the horizontal purple dashed line represents, is our normal body temperature. But our body does not always have to be at exactly 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit in order to be in homeostasis. So there's a little bit of normal fluctuation above or below 98.6 Fahrenheit. So this is what this blue shaded region surrounding our line represents. Our normal body temperature can be anywhere within this blue shaded region and still be considered to be in homeostasis. So biological systems aren't the only thing that use homeostasis like this, especially with controlling temperatures. So if we look at human technology and use a human technology example here, our at-home thermostats that control the air conditioning or the heating in our house also uses this same type of mechanism here, where we set the thermostat at a set point, in this case maybe about 70 or 72 degrees Fahrenheit. And then when our house starts to warm up, our air conditioner turns on, which slowly starts to slow down that rise in temperature, and eventually the temperature in our house starts to go down as the air conditioner pumps cool air into the house and cools off our house. After it reaches that set point, the air conditioner turns off. Our house still continues to cool a little bit, and then after a prolonged period of time when the air conditioner has been off, it starts to warm back. The house starts to warm back up again, and then at some point after the thermostat detects that the room temperature has gone above that set point, the air conditioner will turn back on and begin the cycle all over again. So not only do biological systems use this type of monitoring and feedback to control homeostasis, but we also use this in the technology that we've developed. So hopefully I've convinced you now that homeostasis is essentially a balance in a narrow range. So that's kind of another way to look at it, is the book uses this teeter-totter example to describe homeostasis. So hopefully I've convinced you here that homeostasis is a balance within a very narrow acceptable range. And external factors like in our body temperature example, external factors like ambient air temperature, either really warm ambient air temperature or really cold ambient air temperature, is seeking to disrupt that balance or cause an imbalance in our teeter-totter example here. So let's look at 5 factors that influence the homeostasis of a particular variable. So we'll continue this example with our body temperature example here. And these 5 factors work together to bring balance back to the body's processes when external factors throw them out of balance. So the variable that we're talking about here, in the previous example, we talked about body temperature, but this variable really can be anything occurring in the body. So CO2 levels in the blood is a good example, blood sugar, really any variable within the body. As I mentioned earlier, we used body temperature because that's a pretty simple, straightforward example. But really anything can be this variable of interest here. So let's look at these 5 factors here. The first of these factors is the initial stimulus. So the stimulus is the change in the variable, like a change in body temperature, or a change in blood glucose levels, or a change in blood CO2 levels. So if we go back to that example as well. So the stimulus is the change in the variable that brings the body out of balance here. So it's taking it from balance to imbalance here. Next, we have structures that are called receptors, and receptors are structures that are within the body that detect these changes or stimuli. So receptors are really quite simply change detectors. So all they're doing is detecting the fact that a change has occurred. So this receptor wouldn't be any good, or wouldn't do any good to us if it didn't send that information to some kind of control mechanism within the body. So the receptors then communicate those changes through sensory input pathways, or what are called afferent pathways. And the sensory input pathway is sending information from the receptor to a control center for that particular variable. So if we go back to our body temperature example, body temperature is controlled by a region of your brain called the hypothalamus. And so there are sensory receptors in our skin that detect body temperature and changes in body temperature. And they send this information to the hypothalamus of our brain, which is the control center for our body's temperature, right? So what's happening here is the receptor is simply informing the control center that a change has occurred, right? So the receptor really isn't doing anything other than telling the control center, hey, there's some change that has occurred. It's up to the control center to actually go about making a change to the body to bring balance back to it. So this input pathway is also called the afferent pathway. So I like to think of it, because it starts with an A here, afferent. Think of the information as approaching the control center in this example here. So that's our afferent pathway. So once our control center decides an appropriate response to the stimulus, it issues some output commands through an efferent pathway. So think of the efferent pathway, because it begins with an E here, as information that is exiting the control center. And output from that control center is sent to a structure called an effector. And an effector is really just defined as a structure that carries out the body's response to a particular stimulus, right? So in our body temperature example here, if our stimulus was cold air, then the effectors would be skeletal muscles that cause shivering, and shivering helps to warm up our body. So if our initial stimulus was cold air and our body was to cool down, then the effectors are skeletal muscles that cause shivering and help us to bring our body temperature up, right back into homeostasis. So finally, the 5th part of our homeostasis or the 5th factor of our homeostatic balance graph or chart here is the response. And so finally the effector carries out. The effector is the structure that carries out the body's response to the initial stimulus. And this response then feeds back to reduce the effect of this initial stimulus. So if our body was cooling by cold, if the initial stimulus was cold air and our body was chilled by that cold air, the effectors, being our skeletal muscles, would cause shivering and would feed back to reduce that effect of the cold air. That is, they would warm our body up, right? So this feedback caused by the response can be in one of 2 forms. This feedback can be either positive or negative, and we'll talk about what the positive and negative feedback mechanisms mean. So let's start with negative feedback here, since it is the most common of the feedback mechanisms. And we'll talk about exactly what negative feedback means, because you might be thinking, okay, negative, it's bad, right? But in this particular case, negative feedback is not bad or good. It simply is what it is here, right? So let's look at negative feedback. So negative feedback is feedback in which the stimulus and the response of the homeostatic variable are in opposite directions, right? So if the initial stimulus was warm air, that is, if our body was experiencing a warm external environment, and that warm external environment was threatening to cause our body to overheat, the body's response would be in the opposite direction, right? So, which means that our body's response would be to cool our body off, right? So, in warm air, we will sweat, and that sweat creates evaporative cooling and cools our body off. So, in negative feedback mechanisms, the stimulus and the response are always in opposite directions. And the purpose of negative feedback mechanisms is to really prevent big changes to the body. So that as negative feedback seeks to maintain those normal resting variables like body temperature in those normal homeostatic ranges, like our normal homeostatic body temperature of about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. As I mentioned already, negative feedback is the most common of the homeostasis feedback mechanisms. And we'll go ahead and give two examples here real briefly. So we've already given kind of one example with body temperature. So body temperature is controlled by a negative feedback mechanism. And we'll look at the two examples kind of specifically here. I know I've given you a few details already, but let's go ahead and just kind of review these really quickly, and we can get the full picture here. So recall that our the first of our factors in the homeostatic balance is the initial stimulus, right? So the initial stimulus in body temperature will either be warm external air, so heat, or cold external air. And that will cause our body temperature to either rise if it's warm external conditions, or our body temperature to fall if it happens to be cold outside. Now, as I mentioned, our skin has temperature-sensitive receptors in it. The temperature-sensitive receptors are also located in the brain as well. So both of these are responding to the stimulus of heat and cold. The only thing that's really different is the body's response to these two different temperatures. But the same sets of receptors are activated here. Those receptors then send information to the control center, which is a structure in our brain called the hypothalamus. Here it's called the thermoregulatory center. So there's a specific part of the hypothalamus in our brain that controls body temperature. And so the control center in this example will be the hypothalamus of our brain. The hypothalamus will then issue commands to effectors. So if our body temperature is too warm, those effectors will be sweat glands. If our body temperature is too cold, those effectors will be skeletal muscles. In our example of rising body temperature, the response of our body will be sweating caused by the sweat glands, and that will help cool our body. If our body temperature is too cold, those skeletal muscles will contract and cause shivering, and that will help to bring our body temperature back into balance. That'll help bring our body temperature back up to at least somewhere close to 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. A second example of a negative feedback mechanism is blood glucose levels, particularly after a meal here. So here we'll start on the left side. Here we'll after ingesting some food, our blood glucose levels will begin to rise. That triggers not our brain, but in this case it triggers an endocrine organ, the pancreas, to release a hormone called insulin. And what insulin does is insulin is a hormone that helps our body's cells bring glucose into the cell, that is, bring glucose from the blood into our body's cells and tissues so that our body cells and tissues can use them. So rising blood glucose levels triggers the pancreas to release insulin into our blood. The insulin in our blood then causes the liver to take up glucose, and our liver will use that glucose to make glycogen. So we talked about that earlier in this chapter, that glycogen is really just stored glucose. And insulin is also aiding our body cells in taking up that glucose so that our body cells and tissues can use those. So as our liver and as our body cells and tissues start to take up that blood glucose levels will start to drop back down to their normal homeostatic levels. So that's another example there of a negative feedback mechanism. So let's turn our attention real briefly to positive feedback mechanisms. Even though they're not as common as negative feedback mechanisms, they're still really important for our survival. So positive feedback mechanisms are described as self-amplifying cycles. So these are cycles that build upon one another, kind of like a domino effect here. What we see in positive feedback mechanisms is we see that the stimulus and the response are in the same direction. And the purpose of this positive feedback mechanism is to create a big change in the body, or at least create a big localized change, as it were, for one of the examples that I'm going to give you here. So we'll look at two examples. The first example is blood clotting. So that's a good example of creating a big kind of localized change to seal breaks in blood vessels. And the other is the contractions of the uterus during childbirth. So let's lead with this example of blood clotting here. So let's say we have a break or a cut that occurs in the wall of a blood vessel. This initiates a positive feedback cycle. And that positive feedback cycle starts to activate these small cell fragments in our blood that are called platelets. And platelets begin to adhere to the site of the break, and those platelets start to release these chemicals, and this release of chemicals is our initial stimulus here. These chemicals that are released by the platelets in turn attract more platelets to the site of the break here. And so what happens here is that we have platelets passing by this site. As they pass by, they will adhere to the break in the wall of the blood vessel. And so essentially this positive feedback loop here will continue on and on until there are enough platelets gathered at the break or the tear in the blood vessel wall to seal it. And so this positive feedback loop will then be broken when enough platelets have gathered at the site of the break to plug it. And so the thing that keeps attracting platelets is the chemicals that the platelets release as they gather at the site of the break or the tear and adhere to it. So that's one example of a positive feedback cycle. The second example here is the contractions of the uterus during childbirth. So if we look at our initial stimulus, kind of starting on the left side of this cycle here, we see that as fetal development draws to an end, as the fetus gets larger, the head of the baby pushes against a region of the uterus called the cervix. The cervix is really this kind of narrow region between the uterus and the vagina here. And so the head of the baby pushes against the cervix, and the cervix, being kind of a muscular type structure, has some neurons in it, and those neurons are connected to the brain, and there are nerve impulses that are sent from the cervix to the brain. And the brain responds by releasing a hormone from the pituitary gland called oxytocin. And oxytocin is a hormone that, among other things, causes contraction of the smooth muscle of the uterus. And so as the baby's head is pushing on the cervix, it causes oxytocin to be released. Oxytocin, once it really reaches the muscle of the uterus, then stimulates contractions of the uterus. Those contractions of the uterus then continue to push the baby's head against the cervix, which causes the cycle to begin again, and more oxytocin is released, which causes more contractions, which causes the baby's head to be pushed more and more against the cervix. And then finally this cycle will end when the contractions are so strong and frequent that childbirth has occurred, and that will break the cycle here. So that's another example there of a positive feedback mechanism. So earlier we talked about organ systems. We'll look here at the organ systems that control homeostasis. So probably unsurprisingly, the two organ systems that control homeostasis are the two organ systems that are responsible for signaling and communicating in the body. And remember, we only had two of those organ systems that signal and control. Those were the nervous system and the endocrine system. So even though they had different mechanisms of signaling in the body, the result was still the same, in that both of these organ systems seek to maintain balance within our body and control homeostasis. So to conclude this segment here, I have a little question for you. When we become dehydrated, we become thirsty, and this thirst drives us to drink fluids. So on the basis of what you know about control systems, decide whether this thirst sensation is part of a negative feedback mechanism or a positive feedback mechanism. And in thinking about your answer, I want you to be able to defend your choice here. So I will post the answer to this question in the practice materials for Chapter 1 section of the Chapter 1 module on Moodle.